I was looking at something today about J.R.R. Tolkien and his attitude to Disney. J.R.R. Tolkien, the renowned author of Lord of the Rings and The Hobbit. I used to carry Lord of the Rings around with me when I was at school. When I was expected to play rugby, I used to take the book with me to the rugby pitch and try and hide behind the big H. Tolkien Tolkien genuinely disliked Disney and wrote about it, I believe, in a letter before Snow White was produced and released. Snow White may have changed something or modified his views. I doubt they would have been modified that much. His views were based on his understanding of what a fairy tale was, and he didn't like the simplicity of the Disney approach. He didn't dislike Disney specifically, I suppose, but he had reservations about the commercialization, the adaptation of his works into animated films. But I think the Disney merchandising, which developed with Snow White, would particularly have irked him. His concerns probably stemmed from his deep attachment to his own creation, his desire for his stories to be portrayed in a manner that aligned with his own vision and with the idea that the stories were essentially an oral manifestation in modern English of the traditions of the ancient Nordic tales. He expressed skepticism about turning this complex and richly detailed fantasy world into a simplified, commercialized vision for mass entertainment in the same way he didn't like Dune. I've tried to read Dune many, many, many times, and I've always found it very frustrating because of its layered sort of concentration of pseudo religious tosh with fantasy. And though I quite like pseudo religious tosh, I'm a great fan of Umberto Eco, for example, I find the Dune thing very, very hard to digest. I will keep persisting. I've got an audio book version of almost all the Dune stories now, and I am determined as I sit down to try and do some serious animation to listen to them. But a lot of the time when you're animating, particularly if you're doing dialogue, you want silence. You don't want somebody whittering in your ear, whether it's about Dune or Tolkien. Anyway, Tolkien had a strong affinity for the depth and the seriousness of his own narratives, which um, explored ideas of heroism, of sacrifice, of the struggle between good and evil, and that may have given him some links with Disney's approach to storytelling, but and even in fact his the whimsy and lightheartedness of characters like Tom Bombadil. But but I think the ultimately uh, the lack of humanity was incompatible with the tone and the themes of his own work. His his work, The Lord of the Rings, particularly, is not a novel. You don't see characters progressing. You don't see characters changing. You see characters moving. And it's worth noting that while Tolkien was alive, he actively resisted attempts to adapt his works into other media forms, including film and television. I can't remember when the first radio version of Lord of the Rings was broadcast. I remember one in the 1970s or 1980s, but I don't know if there was one before then. Um, but certainly after his death in 1973, the film rights of Lord of the Rings were eventually sold, leading to the Peter Jackson trilogy, which of course received critical acclaim and broke through so many of the um, brick walls of convention and special effects. So many things were broken in 1964 by Mary Poppins, but it was only with Lord of the Rings that you suddenly got this uh, genuine blend of the impossible. Um, Now, I'm personally very, very fond of Ralph Bakshi's film. I'm very fond of Ralph Bakshi's work in general. Um, what's the film with Brad Pitt? I can't remember what it's called now, but it's I like that one very much. A Cool World, Cool World. I think Ralph Bakshi's work is phenomenal. Fritz the Cat is simply staggering in its invention, in its naughtiness, wizards and so on. A very clever filmmaker, doing things on a shoestring, really. But in you know Tolkien's reservations, Tolkien's reservations about Disney um, most likely stemmed from his desire to preserve the integrity of his literary creations and his concerns about how they might best be interpreted and presented in a different medium, because I don't think he wanted them in a different medium. I think he'd found his medium and that was it. Media was not his aim and his intention. I think he was actually really writing to please himself, and I don't think he imagined these works in any other form.